Team, all of you, well done. Without objection, the following documents will be included in the record: a letter from the Reformed Government Surveillance about the need to reform the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a letter from a coalition of 25 organizations about the need to reform Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and a statement for the record on the topic of today's hearing from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We will start with the gentlelady from Florida, who was part of our working group last year on this issue. The gentlelady, Ms. Lee, is recognized from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and to our witnesses for appearing with us here this morning. Last Congress, I was proud to sponsor the Reforming Intelligence and Securing America Act, or RISA, which was signed into law. RISA included sweeping reforms designed to bring meaningful changes to surveillance operations and prevent the past abuses of FISA from occurring again. As Section 702 is now up for reauthorization, I'm committed to working with this committee to pass a bill that equips our intelligence community with the tools that they need to protect our national security against threats while continuing to protect the civil liberties of Americans. There are two facts that should be evident from today's hearing. First, serious failures occurred under prior FISA and Section 702 authorities, particularly in the FBI's queries of U.S. person data. Second, Congress acted, reforms were imposed, and those reforms are now demonstrably working. The Department of Justice Inspector General has now completed the statutorily required post-reform review under RISA. That report confirms that the FBI did, for years, run non-compliant U.S. person queries, that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court found those practices inconsistent with both statutory law and the Constitution, and that this problem persisted well into the 2020s. Those facts are gravely serious, demanded correction, and did not resolve themselves. But the IG also found that reforms from RISA have been implemented, including mandatory pre-approval by supervisors or attorneys for U.S. person queries, mandatory DOJ audits of every one of those queries, written factual justifications, escalating discipline for negligent, reckless, and intentional violations, and many others. Most importantly, the data now shows a dramatic reduction in non-compliant queries. The IG found that widespread non-compliant querying no longer appears to be occurring, and that the remaining errors are overwhelmingly administrative, typographical, as opposed to structural or abusive. None of this means that oversight is finished. The IG explicitly noted that its post-reform review covers only 1 year, and that continued monitoring is essential. Today, we must continue to assess what further action is needed while recognizing the purpose of FISA, the FISC, and 702. Holding the FBI accountable does not mean stripping the FBI of targeted vital tools that are needed to protect the American people. We did not respond to the past failures by abandoning national security. We responded by tightening the law, raising the standards, hardwiring accountability, and making violations visible and punishable. And that is what we must do again. Mr. Schur, as you know, RISA now requires the FBI to obtain supervisory or legal approval before conducting U.S. person query of Section 702 acquired information, except when there's a reasonable belief that the query could help mitigate or prevent threat to life or serious bodily harm. Why was that additional layer of oversight important?
It was a good change, and it certainly reduces the number of abusive instances of surveillance and examining 702 data that we saw in the past. As we've all discussed, there are several other things that need to be done, but that was a very good and wise change, in my view.
And to what extent has the increased auditing and mandatory reporting, in your perspective, changed personnel behavior? Are there measurable improvements with this compliance? And tell us specifically what additional requirements you believe we need to impose.
Well, there do appear to be improvements. However, as Ms. Goitein mentioned, because the FBI has apparently changed what it considers to be a query, it's not entirely clear the extent to which the number of queries has actually been reduced. And in terms of additional reforms, I would just reiterate the four that I mentioned in my testimony: closing the data broker loophole entirely. Especially if the number of queries is relatively small, there's no longer any argument that it would be a huge administrative burden to get a warrant before the database is searched on Americans, right? And that's something that prosecutors do all the time. They have well-established mechanisms whereby they go to a magistrate. In this case, it would be the FISC, but they send them an email. They outline why they think a warrant is warranted, and they typically get a warrant very quickly in response. It's not a huge burden of the sort that would be suggested if you looked at the Carter Page warrant applications, for example. The Carter Page warrant applications were very extensive, but they are not typical of warrant applications in general. Typically, getting a warrant is a very simple and quick process when a prosecutor has a good reason for getting it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.